This is Philanthropy Unfiltered, a podcast series featuring interviews with philanthropists and leaders in the social sector. I'm Kat Rosqueta, founding executive director of the Center for High Impact Philanthropy. In this episode, our host, Jacob Lief, is joined by Steve Nardizzi, CEO of the Wounded Warrior Project, a $400 million organization that provides services in mental and physical health, economic empowerment, and community engagement to veterans and military personnel. The Wounded Warrior Project's growth as an organization has stirred up debate in the nonprofit sector over nonprofit executive pay, overhead, and fundraising. Today, Steve explains to listeners why he chose to serve veterans, what he thinks of these controversies, and how he hopes the sector can learn from his experiences. Let's join them now.
Maybe you could start by just explaining a little bit what was behind the inspiration for starting Wounded Warrior and how you got involved.
Sure, yeah. I've actually been working with veterans and their transition for about 20 years now. And I had actually started at the request of my uncle and my dad, both World War II vets. And they said if I wasn't going to go into service, I should find a way to give back to those who did. And so started representing vets for a veterans charity and their claims for benefits. When I was in law school, and thought it was going to be 3 years and then I was going to move on and go work for a big firm, and I just fell in love with the work, fell in love with helping others, and it's been the longest temporary career I think of anyone's life. So.
And how did you transition then into Wounded Warriors?
Well, when the conflict started, after 9/11, we saw all these young men and women going off to war, and one of my friends and I, who had been working with other veterans charities, looked around at the systems in place for them. We realized that the country was very ill prepared to help somebody in their 20s and 30s transition back. There was lots of programs and services for folks that were my dad's age, World War II vets, that were Vietnam vets, but there were not really the social supports to help somebody who now has a new disability think through, how do I get back to my community? How do I go back to school, find a new career, be active, cope with some of the psychological traumas, and we just looked at each other and eventually said, somebody's got to do something about this. There has to be a better way, and we finally said, why not us?
And so those early years, what did you find shocking about the nonprofit sector? What were some of the limitations, frustrations during those early years?
Well, one thing that I realized is we did not know so much. We thought we did. We had worked in charities for a while, but running our own, we never realized, because we had always worked on the program side, the amount of effort and energy that really goes into fundraising, into administration, into having your finances in order, and having a legal department. And it is a business. It's a nonprofit business, but it is a business. So we learned a lot of lessons in those early days. But one of the lessons I think that was hardest for us to swallow was some of the governors on our ability to grow in the early days and get out in front of what was a growing need for the population we were trying to serve.
So what were some of those?
Constraints on fundraising. The perception, I think, for the public tends to be that charities are all a bunch of volunteers that are working for free and spending very little money on anything other than direct services, almost handing $1 to the recipients of their cause. And the reality is you can't make an extended impact that way. And trying to combat some of the pressures that we felt from our board, from funders, from the media, to not spend money where we knew we had to spend it in order to make an impact, to not spend on fundraising, build up the infrastructure and systems we knew we needed to make a difference, to not hire the right staff, for instance.
So when was that sort of pivot where you said, hey, we need to start investing deeply into our fundraising, into our back end of the company?
Sure, we were actually in a meeting in 2008, my executive team and I, and it was a budget meeting for the following year. And we were sitting there, and we were about an $18 million organization at the time, and we're serving several thousand warriors. And the research at the time was showing that the need for those who were suffering from post-traumatic stress disorder, traumatic brain injuries, two of the signature wounds of these war, estimated to be hundreds of thousands in need. And we were serving thousands at the time, and talking about a potential budget growth of maybe $1 million the following year, and how we would slice up that pie. And I'm sure anyone who's run a nonprofit has been in those circumstances. You see the need ahead of you really great, and this tiny pie in front of us that we were going to divvy up in our programs. And we said, this is the wrong model. We shouldn't be starting with how much money do we have and how can we spend it. We should be starting with what is the need out there, and then how would we meet that need, and what are the resources we need to meet that need, and then figure out a way to fundraise to that need.
And so you took a step and you started raising, I mean, you were raising 18 then, and I think 300 now?
We're actually on pace for 374 million this year.
That's mind-boggling to think of how much good you can do out there with that kind of money. So when you were back in 2008, when you were still at 18 million, did your board fight you on this? I mean, you were looking to spend, probably 6, 7, 8 million into fundraising then, right?
Oh, absolutely. It was a large push into fundraising. We actually had a dialogue that year with our program staff and said, we're not going to grow programs this year. We're going to take all the money that we had on the table for programs, hold tight, do the best we can with the programs we had in place, with the staff of programs we had in place, and put all that money in fundraising with the promise that after a year, that would start paying dividends. And it was a long dialogue with our board, but fortunately, our board recognized as much as we did what the need was. They saw the numbers coming back. They had come with us to Walter Reed and seen the newly injured. They had seen the big research out there showing this bubble of warriors in need. That became a much easier sell when we focused on what kind of impact do we really want to make. And if we focus on the folks we're trying to serve, and not these outside interests, not the media, not charity rating groups, but really who are we trying to serve and what's in their best interest, became a very easy dialogue over time.
Except you then started facing huge criticism, right?
Oh, absolutely. Fortunately, the one thing that happened that we hoped would happen is the public stayed with us even though the rating groups didn't. The public stayed with us even though some in the media didn't, and they kept giving to us at a higher rate.
So why do you think that was?
I think it's because we were refreshingly honest about the entire dialogue. And when donors called up, we explained to them what our strategy was, and we actually had one. We explained the need for the number of warriors we wanted to serve and the new programs that program areas we wanted to expand into. And we were sort of unabashed about the whole thing. We flipped the dialogue and we said, look, it's not as though we're trying desperately to meet these standards arbitrarily set by the rating groups. We've just decided to ignore them. We have a better model. There's a better way. And it was really refreshing to see folks stick with us and say, yes, I agree with your model, and I want you to serve 100,000 warriors, and you're on pace to do that. Why don't you go do that?
And what is some of the criticism? What, from your point of view? I could read the articles, but I'd love to hear from you.
Sure. My favorite one is I set my own salary. I'm horribly overpaid, right? No one in a charity should make over $100,000, and sort of the tone of you should be ashamed of yourself, and why do you pay people like that? That's probably the number one that comes. I let those wash over me and try and have a reasonable discussion with folks. I don't, of course, set my own salary. I'm paid at the median, and I'm running a $400 million organization, and I usually posit to those folks, who do you want running a $400 million organization? Do you want it a volunteer, part-time person who doesn't have the experience, the professionalism, the degrees, to run it, to make sure that money is being used as intended, that resources are being deployed in an innovative fashion, that you're making an impact? Is that what you want, or do you want somebody who really has that experience? And usually that flips the conversation on its head. But that's probably the number one criticism for me personally that comes at me. And because charities are so public about their compensation, unlike a lot of private companies, it's out there for all to see, so the topic comes up more often than not.
So what's your advice for donors or individuals, foundations who still subscribe to the rating agencies, how they should start thinking differently about when they start to analyze nonprofits and where they invest their money?
Well, absolutely, the model needs to be moving away from arbitrary standards to reasonable thoughts about the strategy a nonprofit has and who they want to serve. So always start with, what is the charity starting to accomplish? That should be or trying to accomplish. That should be the first question. What is the charity attempting to do? Do they have a sound plan to get there? Just like you would ask if you were investing in a business. I'm going to tell you, my plan is to serve 100,000 warriors by 2017, and to make them better in their mental health, to make them better in their physical health, to get them employed and well educated, and have a plan to do that, programs to do it, and a way to measure that over time. And if you can start the dialogue there, then you can have a very good dialogue about, okay, how do you plan on executing on that plan, which is the only way that overhead and fundraising ratios become relevant, is are you investing in the right infrastructure and investing in a fundraising plan that will get you to that impact, that will get you to that outcome at the end.
Do you see a change in the funding world?
I see movement. I think you see some interesting models that are coming about, and whether or not any of them will work, but things like social impact bonds, which very much pay for success, right? Very much the thought of, let's start with what are we trying to achieve, come up with a way to fund it, and then only have governments enter with larger funding models when we've got proof of concept. Some of those are a great push in that direction. I think you hear foundations more often now talking about the need to invest in infrastructure, to allow for there to be a pool of money available to charities to pay their staff, to do learning and development for the teams they hire that are trying to solve the world's social ills. But I don't think the movement is far enough. I think a lot more needs to be done in that space to really allow charities to leverage the capital that they need to do good.
So why do you think, I think one of the biggest criticisms I often hear of Win the Wars is you pay your team well. Why do you think this issue still tends to be one of the driving issues out there in the funding world?
You know, I think there is still this antiquated notion that charities are tiny groups of volunteers who come together, do some bake sales and do a little bit of good. And unfortunately, that notion, I think, has stuck even with funders funding on a massive scale, right? And the challenge with that is it denies the reality that charities are trying to fix, in many cases, some of the world's greatest social ills, things that markets have not been able to fix, things that governments have not been able to fix, folks who are left behind, issues that are left behind by those systems, and yet we're being told to employ people who aren't as well educated. We're being told to pay people less than they're worth, the professionals that you need in order to accomplish that, and that's ridiculous. I usually use my organization as an example of how silly that notion is, and I say, God forbid you had a family member who was injured in service, and they came back wounded and with severe disabilities, and they needed mental health services, and they needed help with their physical health and rehabilitation. They needed help with education. Would you ask, can you find me the least qualified, lowest paid person to do that? Or would you say, no, I want the best of the best of the best at my family member's bedside? Well, of course, you'd say the latter, and of course, that's what we provide, and you have to pay people to do that.
How can we get the smaller nonprofits out there, hundreds of thousands of organizations within a few miles of probably where we're sitting now, to think differently, to say it's okay to spend a little money on my infrastructure? Any advice for these smaller organizations out there?
Don't be afraid to make those choices. And the good news is folks will stay with you. I know not only have I been public in the media on this, I've been public within the industry on this. We took the conversation to our Facebook page, to the public. We have over 3 million Facebook followers, and we went out to them with a blog about this issue, saying, hey, this is how we look at this model. This is how we view overhead. I even grabbed the third rail and went on and posted on my own about my own salary, and said, let's have a discussion if folks want to question it. This is why I make what I make. This is why I pay folks what I pay them, so that we can do the good that we're doing, so we can attract the right and bright, talented people we need to make an impact in our cause. And the response was overwhelmingly positive. And I think if folks get past that fear that their donors will all flock away from them, that hasn't been our experience. It hasn't happened.
What were some of the key strategies you used to raise this kind of money? I mean, you go from 18 million to 350 you're on track for this year. It's extraordinary. So what are some of the ways that Win the War Project goes about raising this money?
Sure. About 2/3 of the money we raise is all direct response, so all small individual gifts through direct mail, through our television ads, and then online. And then we also have a diversified portfolio, so we go for some corporate grants and foundation money as well. And the strategy that we picked, it might not be the right one for everyone. It really aligned with our goal and our mission. We wanted to stay away from government funding because we also do advocacy. We didn't want to chill our advocacy. We stayed away from certain types of sponsorships that didn't fit our mission, like alcohol sponsorships. We have warriors who higher propensity potentially for substance abuse, alcoholism due to combat stress and depression. So we avoided those models and said, if we're going to grow, let's get a deep base of the public to allow us to grow. And that, I think, was really necessary, particularly in the down economy, where we knew corporate giving would be down, foundation giving would be down, but folks who could give $25 would still give $25, and that bore itself out, as we grew in 08 and 9 and 10.
So what were some of the drawbacks using professional solicitors to do this, and what's some of the things that we should be worried about?
Sure. One is you have to have internal staff who understand, if you're going to go after individual giving, what that model looks like. You have to have professional staff if you're going after big foundations who understand that. You can leverage professional fundraisers, and I've had great success leveraging them, but again, they're running a business, you're running a business. You need to have your own internal expertise minding the shop, making sure you're getting the most value out of them, just like you would any other vendor. If you use external accounting staff, somebody's got to manage that. Same rules apply to professional fundraisers.
You hit on something which I so rarely hear those of us in the nonprofit world talk about, and that is the composition of our investors, of our donors.
Sure, I think there is, and I get this too, the smaller you are and the tighter your margins are, there is this sort of push and pressure to take money from any source, no matter where it comes from. And I think the challenge that you can get into as a nonprofit there is, one, you can really be pushed into mission drift, where sometimes funding sources come with their own ideas on how you should further your mission that push you away from where your core competency is. And if they become a primary funding source, it could be a huge challenge for a charity. And I know how difficult it is to turn down money, but we've actually turned down sponsorship offers, we had the state of Florida very generously put a budget proposal in to give us $3.5 million. And I can tell you that it was much easier when we weren't soliciting government funds to say we don't take it than it was to actually turn around and turn down an offer on the table. Here's unsolicited $3.5 million. Think of the good you could do with that. But we also thought, think of the harm we could do to the organization if we start deviating from our strategy, if we start boxing ourselves in and being less innovative, if we start chilling our advocacy. It's something that I think folks in the charity space, nonprofit leaders, need to be mindful of.
I'm going to read back a quote you said, which I liked. Let us be the voice of our own industry and lead the dialogue about charity ethics and effectiveness. The other side of it, though, there is a role for these rating agencies or to hold organizations to greater accountability or responsibility. Where would you like to see these rating agencies sort of evolve in? What would you like to see them evolve into? And how can they be effective in doing what they've set out to do? Because what they've set out to do is not necessarily wrong, right?
Absolutely. I think, I'll be the first to say that continuing to strengthen ethics and accountability across our space, whether it's with professional fundraisers or charities, is vitally important. Anytime you hear of an actual scandal with charities, you run the risk of losing the public trust. So you absolutely need to focus on that. I think where many of the rating agencies go awry is they go beyond giving good information to the public, being an information clearinghouse, and or focusing on fraud, and they create instead, which are models that say this is the way a charity should be run. It has nothing to do with fraud, it has nothing to do with accountability, and it has everything to do with you disagree with basically my business plan. How much I spend on fundraising in a year, how much I put in reserves in a year. That's a business decision. That should be left to charity boards and charity staff. If you want to talk about setting standards for ethics and accountability, BBB's a great example of someone who tries to do that in terms of their standards for good governance. I think GuideStar is another great example of a group that focuses on information sharing, not necessarily trying to fool the public into believing I can tell you which charity is better than another, but making sure that if you're a donor, you have access to good information about a charity's finances. I think those directions are great directions for the agencies to be moving.
Now, how can we get organizations working together to address some of these issues?
I think the dialogue that's drawing people's attention is, how about we stop talking about what we can't do and talk about what we ought to be doing, which is our impact. So can we all get a healthier dialogue about something that I also think is going to be challenging for our industry, because some folks measure their impact a lot better than others. Some folks have the resources to do it more than others. So this dialogue gets tricky at some level. But I think if we're being honest, that's where our focus should be. That's where the dialogue should be. And that's how we're really going to change this perception, is getting everyone talking about that. But that means we need to be honest about it too. We need to actually be measuring our impact. We need to be transparently reporting it, the good, the bad, and the ugly, and there will be failures that we'll all have along the way. We need to be okay with that and reporting that out. I think that moves the dialogue in the right direction.
Sure. So what's the future look like for your organization?
We are right now actually envisioning our next 5 years. So we're in the middle of a strategic planning section, looking forward 5 years and doing the same thing, saying what are the needs going to be of our constituents, and how are they going to change over another 5 years. We have a population that was in their 20s and 30s that's now going to be in their 30s and 40s, and so they're going to be needing different types of services. We have a very large field that opened up with a lot of new nonprofits focused on veterans issues, and as we get farther away from the recent conflicts, money is dying down, availability of funds towards those issues. So I think part of our strategy is going to be a much greater collaboration across our space with other charities who are doing really good work in the space. How do we all work better together and leverage resources better to do more good? But I can tell you we're having the same discussion now that we had in 2008. It starts with where do we need to be in 2021, 5 years out from 2017 when our current plan ends, and then how much resources do we need, and then we'll figure out how we get there.
Right. So say a young hedge fund manager comes to you and says, Steve, respect what you're doing, I'd love your advice, I'm setting up a $100 million foundation. What would you tell them what they should be looking at, how they should start approaching giving away their money?
Well, first thing is, I would say don't start with looking at the finances. Start with thinking about what cause do you believe in? What causes are you passionate about? Then look for charities in that space that you think are making a difference, and ask them, it could be even some simple questions. How are you going to, if the issue is cure cancer, if the issue is educate underprivileged youth, how are you going about it? How do you differentiate yourself from other groups that are going about it? And can you show me the results that you're achieving? And if the answers to those questions are yes, then I'd say do what you would always then do if you were going to invest in a business. Say, okay, now let me see your business plan. Now let me see your finances. Now let me see how you're going to get there. And that should always be the start of the dialogue. Just like you would in the for-profit side, you can get to that same answer in the nonprofit side.
Thank you so much. I really appreciate your time. This was terrific.
Thanks for having me.
Awesome.
You've been listening to Philanthropy Unfiltered, a podcast series featuring interviews with philanthropists and leaders in the social sector. This podcast is a collaboration between the Ubuntu Education Fund and the Center for High Impact Philanthropy at the University of Pennsylvania. For more on this series, visit impact.upenn.edu. Thanks for listening.